The bitter cold of winter has a way of reminding you just how fragile life can be. That morning, as I stepped outside and saw my breath curling into the sharp December air, I felt both grateful and nervous. Grateful, because after years of planning and saving, I finally had my little cabin tucked away at the edge of the woods. Nervous because the winter here wasn't forgiving if you weren't prepared. It could swallow you whole. That's why, back in autumn, I had stacked my firewood pile so carefully. Months of chopping, hauling, and stacking it wasn't just a pile of logs, it was my survival. Each piece of wood represented sweat, work, and security. I could look at that tall, neat stack against my cabin wall and know I'm safe this winter. But safety has a way of drawing the wrong kind of attention, because right across the road, in a house that seemed far too fancy for this humble little valley, lived Karen. And if you've ever met someone who thinks they own more than just their property, but the people around it too, then you already know what kind of trouble was waiting for me. I was hauling a smaller load of wood into the cabin when I heard her voice call out from the road. "John." She shouted in that sharp, entitled tone she always used, as if the world was her personal stage. "That's an awfully big pile of wood you've got there." I turned, half smiling, trying to keep things civil. "Winter's long out here, Karen. You never know how much you'll need." She walked closer, wrapped in a puffy white coat, her nose red from the cold, but her eyes glinting with something sharper. "Funny thing," she said, "our HOA doesn't actually allow wood piles that high. It looks unsightly." I nearly laughed. "Karen, this is my property. And that wood isn't for decoration, it's for keeping my home warm. You can't expect me to take it down," she smirked, tilting her head. "Rules are rules, John. We'd like to keep this neighborhood looking civilized." I clenched my jaw, but said nothing. I had dealt with her nonsense before, her complaining about my cabin roof being too rustic, her telling guests not to park on my own driveway. But this touched survival. And that's when I should have known Karen wasn't just talking about appearances. She had other plans for that firewood. 3 nights later, the temperature dropped like a hammer. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of my cabin, and the fire inside my stove crackled and hissed. It was around midnight when I heard the crunch of footsteps outside at first. I thought maybe it was a deer nosing through the snow. But then came the clatter, the distinct sound of logs being shifted, one tumbling against another. My heart jolted. I pulled on my coat, grabbed my flashlight, and pushed open the cabin door. The beam of light cut through the snowy darkness, and there she was. Karen, her gloved hands were gripping 2 of my logs, dragging them awkwardly across the frozen ground toward the road. Behind her, a little red sled sat waiting, half filled with wood she had already taken. "Karen," I barked, the cold air biting into my throat. "What in God's name are you doing?" She froze, caught in the light like a thief in the night. But instead of shame, her face twisted with defiance. "Your pile is ridiculous," she snapped. "My fireplace went out, and I need this." "You have plenty. Don't be greedy." My jaw dropped. "Greedy, Karen? This is my winter heat. You can't just take what doesn't belong to you." "Oh, stop being dramatic," she hissed. "The HOA has already talked about limiting these piles anyway. I'm just redistributing." Distributing. That word burned through me like fire. She wasn't just stealing, she was justifying it. I stepped closer, my boots crunching in the snow. "Drop the logs, Karen. Right now." She straightened, clutching them tighter. "If you lock your gate, I'll just call the HOA board. Or the sheriff. Let's see how they feel about your so-called unsightly wood hoard." The arrogance in her tone was unbelievable. My blood pounded in my ears. This wasn't about wood anymore, it was about control. She wanted to prove she could take whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted. "You want heat, Karen?" I said, my voice low. "You should have prepared." "Like the rest of us do. Like I did. You don't steal from your neighbors." For a moment, her eyes flickered not with guilt, but with something like fear, because she could see in my face that I wasn't going to roll over this time. She dropped the logs back into the snow with a huff, grabbed her sled, and yanked it toward the road. But as she passed me, she muttered under her breath. "You'll regret this, John." The very next morning, I bought a heavy chain and a new lock. My driveway had an old wooden gate, more for decoration than anything else. But now, I wrapped that chain around it and locked it tight. From the cabin window, I watched Karen drive past in her shiny SUV, slowing down when she saw the locked gate. Her face twisted, and even through the frosted glass, I could see the fury in her eyes. Good, I thought. Let her stew. But I underestimated just how far she'd go. The following week brought the coldest night yet. The radio said it would dip below zero, dangerous for anyone without proper heat. I stoked my fire until the cabin glowed with warmth. But as the wind shrieked outside, I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. And there she was, Karen. Standing just outside the locked gate, her arms wrapped around herself, shivering violently. Her breath came in white plumes, her eyes wide and desperate. "John," she cried out, her voice cracking in the icy wind. "Please let me in." The sight stopped me cold. This wasn't the smug, entitled woman I had battled for months. This was someone on the edge, someone who had thought she could bully her way through life, and now was staring at the cost of her arrogance. I didn't move. Part of me burned with anger, remembering her smug face dragging my logs through the snow. But another part of me deep down felt something else tugged. Pity. She clung to the gate, her teeth chattering. I don't have heat. I thought I'd be fine, but my pipes are freezing. Please, just for tonight." I stood there, the cold air swirling between us, torn between justice and mercy. Because here's the truth. Sometimes life puts you in a position where your choices don't just define your survival. They define the kind of person you are. And that night, I had to decide, would I let the woman who tried to steal from me into the warmth of my home? Or would I leave her out there to face the cold she had brought upon herself? The cold wind howled like a wild animal, shaking the trees around the cabin. Snow whipped through the air, stinging my face as I stared at Karen clinging to my locked gate. Her lips trembled, her hands shook, and her eyes, usually sharp with arrogance, were wide with desperation. "John, please," she begged, her voice hoarse. "I'll freeze out here. Just let me inside for the night." For a long moment, I didn't move. The memory of her dragging my firewood through the snow only days before burned in my mind. She had smirked at me then, called me greedy, acted as though my hard work belonged to her. And now here she was, powerless, exposed, begging for the very thing she tried to steal. Part of me wanted to slam the cabin door, stoke the fire, and leave her to learn her lesson the hard way. But another part of me, the part that still believed in being human. Even when others weren't, hesitated. I walked to the gate slowly, my boots crunching in the snow. "Karen," I said firmly, "this didn't have to happen. You could have prepared. You could have asked, but instead, you tried to take what wasn't yours." Her teeth chattered, but she managed to spit out, I know I was wrong. Please, just this once. I don't have anyone else to turn to." I studied her face. For the first time since I'd known her, the mask of entitlement was gone. She wasn't barking orders or quoting HOA rules. She wasn't the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. She was just a woman caught in the deadly grip of winter. But mercy wasn't simple. Letting her inside could mean opening the door to more trouble, more manipulation, more entitlement. Yet closing that door, well, that could mean something far worse. "Stay there," I said finally. I went back inside, grabbed a spare blanket from the shelf, and returned to the gate. She looked at me like a drowning woman reaching for a life raft. I pushed the blanket through the bars. "Wrap yourself in this. You're not coming in, not tonight. You'll stay outside, but you won't freeze." Her face twisted in disbelief. "You can't be serious. You're going to make me sit out here in the snow like an animal?" I crossed my arms. "You made your choice when you tried to steal from me. Actions have consequences, Karen." Her jaw clenched, but her eyes watered. She yanked the blanket around her shoulders. glaring at me as if she wanted to scream, but the bitter cold kept her silent. I turned back toward the cabin. Each step away from her felt heavy, but I told myself it was the right thing. Mercy had limits, and sometimes lessons had to be learned the hard way. Inside, the fire crackled and warmth wrapped around me like a shield. But I couldn't shake the image of Karen sitting just beyond my gate, her body trembling under the blanket. I tried to distract myself, made tea, read a book, but every gust of wind outside seemed to carry her faint voice, her shivering breath. My chest tightened. What if she doesn't make it through the night? I pushed the thought away. She'll be fine. She's strong enough. And besides, she brought this on herself. But as midnight came and went, the guilt grew heavier. At around 2 in the morning, I stood by the window, looking out at the gate. The snow had piled high, and my flashlight beam barely caught her slumped figure, wrapped tight in the blanket. She wasn't moving much. Damn it, I muttered. I threw on my coat, grabbed a lantern, and trudged through the snow to the gate. Karen stirred weakly as I approached, her face pale, her lips blue. "John," she whispered. I can't feel my hands." My heart sank. This had gone too far. I unlocked the gate with trembling fingers, pulled her arm over my shoulder, and half carried her toward the cabin. She was lighter than I expected, her strength drained by the cold. Inside, I settled her into the chair nearest the fire, piled blankets over her, and handed her a steaming mug of tea. She gripped it with shaking hands, tears spilling down her cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you." I sat across from her, my own emotions churning. Relief, anger, confusion. "What were you thinking, Karen?" I asked quietly. "Why didn't you just ask for help?" She stared into the fire, her voice small. "Because I didn't want to admit I needed it. People like me don't ask, we take. It's easier." Her words struck me like a blow. For the first time, she was admitting the truth. As the hours passed, her shivering slowed and color returned to her cheeks. But the firelight also revealed something I had never seen before in her regret. "John," she said finally, her voice thick, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have touched your woodpile. I panicked. My furnace broke, and I didn't want anyone to know I couldn't handle it." I frowned. "So instead of asking for help, you tried to steal." Her eyes glistened. "I've spent my whole life controlling people. My husband left me years ago because of it. My kids barely call. And when the HOA made me president, I thought, finally, I'm important again. But really, I'm just alone. And I didn't know how to face that." The raw honesty in her voice stunned me. For so long, she had been the villain of every story in this neighborhood. Yet now, sitting by my fire, she seemed less like a tyrant and more like a broken person trying to hold on to power she never really had. I leaned back, sighing. "Karen, you made my life hell. You humiliated me in front of neighbors, threatened me with rules that don't exist, and now you nearly froze outside my gate. Do you see how dangerous this path is?" Her head dropped. "Yes," she whispered, "and I don't want to be that person anymore." The silence stretched between us, heavy but strangely healing. Finally, I said, "You're welcome to stay until morning. After that, we'll figure out how to get your furnace fixed. But hear me, Karen. If you ever touch my woodpile again, if you ever try to bully me or anyone else, I won't hesitate to let you face the cold again." She nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "I understand. Thank you for not letting me die out there." When dawn came, sunlight spilling over the snowy hills, Karen looked like a different woman. She was quiet, humble, even grateful. She helped me clean up the dishes, folded the blanket she'd used, and before she left, she stopped at the door. "John," she said softly, "I'll make this right somehow." I watched her walk back across the road to her fancy house, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, yes, but also hope. Maybe, just maybe, the ice around her heart had begun to thaw. But as I turned back toward the fire, I noticed something on the floor, a small scrap of paper that must have slipped from her coat pocket. I bent down and picked it up. It wasn't just a note. It was an HOA violation notice and, It had my name on it. Filed before the night she froze outside, and the violation: excessive firewood pile, subject to immediate removal and fines. My hands trembled as I stared at the paper. Had she really changed? Or was this just another game? I stood in the cabin doorway, the paper trembling in my hand. The violation notice stared back at me like an accusation carved in stone. Excessive firewood pile, subject to immediate removal and fines. The date at the top made my stomach twist. It had been filed 2 days before the night Karen nearly froze outside my gate. 2 days before her desperate plea for help. So what was last night then? A genuine moment of humility, or another manipulation in a long string of power games? The fire crackled behind me, but I felt cold. I couldn't shake it. All morning, I stared at that notice, replaying every word Karen had said. The regret in her voice, the tears in her eyes, the fragile way she admitted she was lonely. But now I wondered if all of it had been a performance. By noon, I'd had enough. I folded the paper into my pocket and marched across the snow to her house. My boots crunched against the frozen ground, my breath fogging in the air. When I reached her porch, I knocked dash hard. Karen opened the door, bundled in a sweater, her face pale, but calmer than the night before. "John," she said softly, "you came." I held up the violation notice. "Care to explain this?" Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, before she looked down. "I was going to tell you," she whispered. "But I didn't know how." "Don't lie to me, Karen," I snapped. "You sat by my fire last night, telling me you wanted to change. Meanwhile, you'd already filed this with the HOA. Were your tears fake? Was all of it fake?" She looked up at me then, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. "No, John, it wasn't fake. But yes, I filed it. I thought I could control you like I've controlled everyone else. That's who I was. And now, I hate it. Do you have any idea what this means?" I asked, my voice rising. "If this goes through, they can find me. They can make me take down the pile I worked months to build. You almost froze on my doorstep, Karen, and this was sitting in your pocket the whole time." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'll fix it, I promise. I'll go to the board and withdraw the complaint." I studied her face, searching for signs of deception. She looked broken, but I'd learned the hard way that appearances didn't always tell the truth. Later that week, I got my answer not from Karen, but from the HOA itself. A letter arrived in my mailbox. Official notice of violation. The same words I had seen on Karen's paper, now stamped and signed. My blood boiled. She hadn't withdrawn it. I stormed into town for the next HOA meeting. The small hall was packed with neighbors, most of them bundled in heavy coats, faces flushed from the cold. At the head of the table sat the board members, and right beside them, in her usual seat of power, was Karen. I slammed the letter down on the table. "What is this?" I demanded. The room went silent. One of the board members cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitaker, your firewood pile exceeds the allowed size for residential properties. It's a violation of community standards." I laughed bitterly. Community standards? That pile is the only thing standing between me and freezing to death in this cabin. Who complained, huh? Who put my name on this notice? Every eye turned to Karen. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, then said softly, "I did." Gasps rippled through the room. "You?" I roared, "after everything that happened. After I saved your life." Karen's face burned crimson. "I filed it before that night, John. Before. I was too proud to admit it afterward, and by then the process had already started. I couldn't undo it. Couldn't? Or wouldn't." The room murmured with whispers. A man from the back, old Bill, who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, stood up. "Now hold on, Karen. You mean to tell us this man saved you from freezing, and you're still trying to punish him for stacking wood to keep warm?" "That's madness," another neighbor chimed in. "She's been on my case for my Christmas lights, too. Said they were too bright. This is out of hand." The murmurs grew louder. People were nodding, glaring at Karen, some even crossing their arms in defiance. For the first time, the power she always wielded seemed to slip through her fingers. Karen rose to her feet. her voice trembling. I only wanted what was best for the neighborhood. I thought order meant respect. I thought. Her voice broke. I thought it would make me matter. The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Bill spoke again. Karen, you matter because you're our neighbor, not because you hand out fines and complaints. You've turned this HOA into your throne, and it's tearing us apart. The board members exchanged uneasy looks. One finally said, perhaps this complaint was unnecessary. Especially under these conditions. I seized the moment. Withdraw it, I said firmly. Take it off the record, or I'll see this entire board in court. The neighbors erupted in agreement. The pressure was undeniable. Karen sank back into her chair, tears streaking her cheeks. Withdraw it, she whispered. And just like that, the violation was gone. After the meeting, I stepped out into the icy evening air. Snowflakes swirled around me, but for the first time in weeks, I felt lighter. Neighbors approached me one by one, patting my back, thanking me for standing up, but as the crowd dispersed, Karen lingered on the steps of the hall. She looked small, her shoulders hunched, her face blotchy from crying. John, she said quietly, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I meant what I said that night by your fire. I don't want to be this person anymore. Stared at her, torn between anger and pity. Karen, you can't erase what you did with words. Change doesn't come from apologies. It comes from actions. Then I'll show you. Somehow.
Oh.
And with that, she walked away into the falling snow, leaving me with a strange ache in my chest. Back at my cabin, I restacked a few logs, my breath curling in the frigid air. But just as I set the last one in place, headlights swept across my yard. A car pulled up, tires crunching against the snow. It wasn't Karen's SUV, it was a sheriff's cruiser. My stomach dropped as the door opened and the sheriff stepped out, holding a clipboard. Evening, John, he said grimly. Got some complaints here we need to talk about. The sheriff's boots crunched against the snow as he walked toward me, clipboard in hand. His breath puffed in the cold night air, and the beam from his cruiser's headlights stretched long shadows across my woodpile. Evening, John, he said in a steady, official tone. We've had a string of complaints come through the HOA office about your property. My stomach twisted. Complaints. I thought that was settled at the meeting. He raised an eyebrow. The firewood complaint? Yeah, I heard about that one. But these aren't just about the firewood. I've got notes here about noise, smoke, and even reports that you're storing hazardous materials on your land. I blinked, stunned. Hazardous materials? Sheriff, all I've got is chopped wood and a couple cans of kerosene. That's survival, not a crime, sighed, glancing at the clipboard. Look, I know how this HOA can be, but I've got to follow up when complaints pile up like this. If I don't, it looks like I'm ignoring the law. I didn't need to guess who was behind it. My eyes flicked to the road across from my cabin, where Karen's house sat dark and silent under the snow. This is her, I muttered. She's trying to bury me in paperwork because she lost her grip at the meeting. The sheriff gave a tired shrug. I can't say who filed them confidential, you know. But between you and me, he lowered his voice, half these things don't even make sense. Smoke from a wood stove? Out here? That's survival 101. My chest tightened with anger. So what happens now? He flipped through his clipboard. I'll file the report, but honestly, it'll probably just sit on someone's desk. You're not breaking any real laws. Just keep your head down, John, and maybe talk to your neighbor. I laughed bitterly. Talk to her. Sheriff, the only language she understands is control. The sheriff left, and I went back inside, the warmth of my cabin doing little to thaw the ice in my chest. Karen had looked me in the eyes and promised change. She'd admitted her loneliness, her regrets. And still, she'd gone behind my back to try and ruin me. But the next morning, just as I was splitting kindling, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, I nearly dropped the axe. It was Karen. She stood there in the snow, her hair windblown, her eyes rimmed red from crying. But her hands held something I never expected, a folded letter. I know about the sheriff, she said quietly. And I know you think it was me. But it wasn't. I frowned. You expect me to believe that? Her voice trembled. I deserve your suspicion. But John, I swear on my life I didn't file those new complaints. I only filed the woodpile one. I told you that. And after the meeting, I withdrew it. She held out the letter. This is proof. A copy of the withdrawal I gave the HOA board. I wanted you to see it yourself. I unfolded the paper with shaking hands. It was signed, dated, official. She had, in fact, pulled back the violation. Then who was trying to bury me? Karen, I said slowly. If it wasn't you, then who? She shook her head, her breath fogging in the icy air. I don't know. But I've been on that board long enough to know one thing. Someone else wants you gone, and they're using me as the scapegoat. Words struck me like a hammer. For weeks I had painted her as the villain, the mastermind of every cruel twist. But now it looked like she wasn't the only one pulling strings. I narrowed my eyes. Why would anyone else care about me or my firewood? Her lips pressed into a thin line. Because your land is valuable, John. More valuable than you realize. The HOA has been eyeing it for months, talking about turning it into a community recreation space. I fought them on it. Her voice faltered. I think they've decided to push you out by any means necessary. I studied her face. She looked exhausted, worn down, not the smug queen of the HOA. But a woman stripped of her power? So now you expect me to trust you? I asked bitterly. Her shoulders slumped. No, I expect you to hate me. But I also expect you to want the truth. And the truth is, you're not just fighting me anymore. You're fighting the entire board. The silence between us stretched long and heavy. I wanted to slam the door, to tell her to leave me alone forever. But something in her voice, raw, desperate, kept me rooted. Why are you telling me this? I finally asked. Her eyes glistened. Because you saved my life. And I can't let them destroy yours. Not after that. That night I couldn't sleep. Her words replayed in my head over and over. Not just Karen. The board. They want your land. For months, I had seen her as the face of my misery. But now, the possibility that she was only the front for something bigger made my stomach churn. And then, around midnight, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps outside. This time, I grabbed my lantern and my rifle. I pushed open the door, the cold slapping me in the face, scanned the yard. Thereby, the woodpile, two figures in dark coats, dragging logs toward a pickup truck parked by the road. Hey, I roared, storming across the snow. The figures froze. Then, without a word, they dropped the logs and bolted into the night. The truck roared to life, tires spinning in the snow, and sped away down the road. I stood there, breath heaving, the woodpile scattered. This wasn't about Karen anymore. This was war. The next morning I found Karen waiting by my gate. She looked pale, her hands stuffed into her coat pockets. I heard the truck last night, she said softly. It wasn't me. I swear it. But I think I know who it was. I eyed her suspiciously. Go on, her voice lowered. Tom Miller. HOA Vice President. He's been pushing for your land harder than anyone. He's the one who suggested the Community Lake Access Project. He thinks if he can make your life miserable enough, you'll sell and leave. I clenched my fists. So all this time, you were just his cover? Her lips trembled. Yes, and I was too proud to admit it, too desperate to feel powerful. But John, she swallowed hard. I'm sorry, truly. And if you'll let me, I'll help you fight them. I stared at her, my heart torn between fury and an unexpected flicker of hope. Could I trust her? Could the woman who once tried to steal my firewood now become the ally I needed? Before I could answer, a letter slid into my mailbox. Carried by the morning wind, I pulled it out, tore it open, and read the words that made my blood run cold. Final notice. Failure to comply with HOA orders will result in forced removal of property structures and legal seizure. I looked up at Karen, the paper trembling in my hands. They're not just coming for my firewood, I whispered. They're coming for everything. The winter storm hit harder than anyone predicted. Wind howled like an angry spirit through the trees, rattling the windows of my cabin. Snow piled against the doors, and the world outside turned into a frozen wasteland. Inside, I sat by the crackling fireplace, the warmth seeping into my bones. The firewood stacked neatly along the wall felt like security. Each log a promise that my wife and I would be safe, no matter how long the storm lasted. But as I looked through the frosted window, I noticed something unusual. Headlights cut through the swirling snow near the edge of my property. At first I thought it might be a stranded traveler, but then I saw her figure. It was Karen, wrapped in a coat far too thin for the storm. She stumbled through the drifts, dragging a sled behind her loaded with the very firewood she had stolen the night before. My heart clenched. It was one thing to bicker over property lines and HOA rules, but this was different. She was pale, shivering, and clearly unprepared. She had no business being out in this weather. My first instinct was anger. Serves her right, I thought, but then I saw her fall to her knees, clutching her hands to her chest. The storm wasn't just cold. It was dangerous. I grabbed my coat and went outside, the icy air biting my skin instantly. "Karen!" I shouted over the wind. "What on earth are you doing out here?" She looked up, her eyes glassy. "I don't have any wood left," she admitted, her voice trembling as much from fear as from the cold. "My heater broke, and the HOA won't help. I thought if I could just get more firewood I'd be okay." For a moment, I stood there frozen not from the cold, but from disbelief. The mighty HOA president, who had lorded her authority over every neighbor, was now crumbling before me, begging in the snow. I clenched my jaw. "And you thought stealing from me again was the answer?" Tears streaked down her red cheeks. I didn't know what else to do. I was desperate. "Please. My son's at home, and he's freezing." The mention of her son hit me harder than I expected. I remembered when my own kids were small, how fiercely I would have fought to protect them from harm. The anger in my chest softened, replaced by something I hadn't felt toward her before: pity. I pulled her to her feet. "Get up. You'll freeze to death out here. Bring that sled back to my cabin. It's inside." My wife looked at me with wide eyes as I ushered Karen in. Her clothes were damp, her face pale, but as the warmth of the fire touched her skin, a bit of color returned. She sat silently, shivering, staring at the flames as if she'd never seen something so precious. For the first time in years. The cabin wasn't filled with Karen's commands or insults. It was filled with silence. Heavy, emotional silence. Finally, she whispered, "I've been wrong. About a lot of things." My wife raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Karen's eyes glistened in the firelight. "I always thought being strict, keeping control, and enforcing rules made me strong. But the truth is, it made me lonely. I drove people away. Even the HOA board doesn't stand with me anymore. And now, when I need help, I've got nowhere to go." Her words sank into the quiet room. For the first time, she wasn't Karen the HOA tyrant. She was just a woman, scared, vulnerable, and lost. I sighed deeply, staring at the fire. "Karen, no one can survive a winter alone. You need people, and people need kindness. Maybe it's not too late to start over." Her eyes met mine, shimmering with regret. For the first time, I saw humility in her gaze. That night, as the storm raged outside, 3 people sat around the fire, former enemies, now bound by survival, warmth, and perhaps the first spark of understanding. The storm raged on for 2 full days. Snow blanketed the valley in silence, broken only by the occasional crack of ice-laden branches snapping in the forest. Inside my cabin, the fire burned bright, fueled by the very logs Karen had once tried to steal. Funny how things come full circle. Karen sat near the fire most of the time, her son bundled in blankets beside her. My wife, though cautious at first, eventually softened, offering Karen warm soup and an extra quilt. The boy, innocent and shy, smiled gratefully with every sip. And in those moments, I realized something: sometimes the sins of the parents don't have to stain the children. One evening, as the storm finally began to ease, Karen spoke in a voice so quiet I had to lean in to hear. "I know you'll never forgive me for all I've done," she said, staring into the flames. "But I want you to know I'm sorry. Not just for the firewood. For years of making your lives harder than they should have been. For being me." Her words carried weight, heavy with regret. I took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the fire settle into me. "Karen," I said slowly, "I don't know if forgiveness comes all at once. But I do know this: everyone makes mistakes. What matters is whether we learn from them." She blinked quickly, fighting tears. "I want to change. I don't want to be that person anymore." The silence that followed was not awkward, but healing. Even my wife, who had endured more than her share of Karen's arrogance, gave a small nod. By the time the storm broke, the three of us had built something unexpected, a fragile, tentative truce. Karen gathered her boy and prepared to leave, standing at the door with her hands trembling, not from cold, but from nerves. "I'll find a way to repay you," she whispered. "I promise." I shook my head gently. "Don't repay me. Just be better. That'll be enough." The look on her face was something I'll never forget. Gratitude, relief, and maybe for the first time, peace. Weeks later, the snow melted, and spring returned to the valley. One morning, I stepped outside to find a neat stack of freshly chopped firewood by my gate. No note, no words, but I knew who it came from. And for the first time in years, I smiled when I thought of Karen, because in the end, it wasn't about firewood or frozen nights. It was about something deeper, the chance for people to change, the chance to choose kindness over pride, and the chance to turn enemies into neighbors again, and that's a lesson worth more than any pile of wood. This story is just the beginning. There is so much more ahead. Subscribe to the channel to join me on this journey.